Hi, and welcome to Covenant Bible Fellowship tonight. As we take a look at the Old Testament, we're going to be trying to tackle an interesting timeline question. It's going to be a one that was brought up earlier in the week during one of the members' private studies, looking in Chronicles. So we're going to be looking in Chronicles and Kings, Second Chronicles, Second Kings, in order to take a look at something which looks like a time discrepancy, but isn't. So this is not a traditional, large, sort of over-the-top, hard question where we're looking at an emotionally difficult subject. This is more of the minutia style question, and yet it's these small ones that really will pull the faith out from under a lot of people. There's a lot of folks in the church who have a very general understanding of the gospel, and they feel like they're okay with that. And so they run with that for all their lives until they're put face to face with something like this. And since they can't explain it and they don't understand it, they end up losing faith in God because they see that the Bible has supposedly errors in it. So it is important for us to understand how to rightly divide the word of truth and how to understand these so-called errors and sort of pick them apart. So we're going to take a look first in 2 Kings 16. Now, I am most familiar with the King James Version, so we are going to be using that one for this particular study. We're going to look in 2 Kings 16 and read through the first few verses here. It says, "In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign." Now, this phraseology is going to be important. We're going to need to remember this. Now, but let's continue on. It says, 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, yea, and made his son to pass through the fire, that is, through the fire to Molech, according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. Tall and short of it, that was a practice of human sacrifice which had a focus on sexual pleasure. And in order to get away from the consequences of said sexual pleasure, when you had a child, you would abort that child or sacrifice that child to the god Molech. And he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places, and on the hills, and under every green tree. And then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria, drave the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to the king of Assyria, etc., etc., etc. And he continues on here until we see that Ahaz took the silver and gold that was in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And so the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. King Ahaz went to Damascus to make Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saw an altar that was at Damascus, and King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the fashion of the altar, the pattern of it, according to all the workmanship thereof. And Urijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it against King Ahaz, came from Damascus. And when the king was come from Damascus, the king saw the altar, the king approached the altar and offered thereon. He burnt his burnt offering and meat offering, poured his drink offering, sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings upon the altar, brought also the brazen altar which was before the Lord from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. There's a lot of detail here, but essentially what he's done is he has not only stolen the gold and silver from the house of the Lord, offered it to a heathen king, or basically to purchase his troops as mercenaries, but then now has set up an altar to a foreign god. Then it continues on to the end where it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Ahaz, which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah?" Which we'll see here in a second, because remember, this is, excuse me, this is 2 Kings. Excuse me again. and we will take a look in a moment in 2nd Chronicles. It says, "Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Ahaz slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his stead," who, if you've read through this section, you'll know became a very good king. So we're going to look back at Ahaz again, but now we're going to look at what Ahaz did as far as what Chronicles says. So let's take a look at Chronicles verse 28. Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles chapter 28, and we'll start at the very beginning. Now this one I am looking at in the English Standard Version. I can switch over to the King James. Actually, I think I'm going to switch over to the King James just for continuity's sake, because we were already in the King James prior. So it says, "Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem." Now, does this match up? Let's see. Remember, at the beginning of 2 Kings 16, it says, "In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign." This is a common way of measuring time, because at the time, you don't have, like we do now, a uniform, like the Julian calendar was and whatnot. You don't have a worldwide calendar that everyone follows. What year is it? If I were to ask you that question, you would be able to tell me a number that signifies the year, and it's based on, as many scientists believe, an arbitrary, but a religious, honestly, date, which is the believed date of Christ's birth. And so we say that, yes, it's the year 2019, which is 2019 years after supposedly Jesus was born. Of course, we realize that that's probably not an accurate date. It's most likely off by a number of years, but the point remains that is our measurement system for time. Now, at this time, they did not use a similar measurement system. There was no universal measurement system, and so they measured based on the years of the other kings in the area. So they said, this king has been reigning for 17 years when our king took his seat, right? So they sort of had this way of looking at the tapestry of time and saying, this king reigned for this long, and in the 14th year of this king started, and then he reigned for this long, and this king picked up in this king's 15th year. So it's a lot more complicated, but that's what they're using here in this section. So we can kind of skip over that, because that's not the important part of what we're looking at here. The important part of what we're looking at is how old was Ahaz and how long did he reign. So let's see again. 2 Chronicles 18 says, "Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem." All right, now let's look back at verse 2 here in 2 Kings. It says, "20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father." So the two of them actually match there. There's no conflict between the two. And it continues on. It says, "He did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God." But he continues on. Now, we have the folks who threw tonight's question out with us. I'm going to ask for you to put in your best terms what conflict you saw between these two passages, so we can try and take a look at it. And while they're doing that, we're going to look down through 2 Chronicles, and we're going to see that is a little bit more detailed, because what it talks about is it doesn't just say that he, as in verse 4 of 2 Kings 16, it says, "And he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places on the hills under every green tree." That's about as detailed as it gets. In 2 Chronicles, it says, made molten images for Balaam, burnt incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, burnt his children in the fire after the abominations of the heathen, sacrificed also and burnt incense in the high places on the hills under every green tree, and continues, right? So it goes into a little bit more detail. And then it continues down to, let's see here. There we are. Verse 25, it says, "And in every several city of Judah he made high places to burn his incense unto other gods," which is something you don't necessarily see directly laid out in the other side. Those altars were not to God, they were to other gods. And so this says, "He provoked to anger the Lord God of his fathers. The rest of his acts and his ways, first and last, behold, they are written in the books of the kings of Judah and Israel." And so they sort of both reference each other, saying, you can look at it one way or you can look at it another way, but this is what he's done. Okay, so the conflict, it says, came from archaeologists and historians who said he actually reigned 20 years. If he only reigned 16, he had to be pretty young to be a father, since his son was about 25 when he took over. Okay, so we remember that he was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. Now, you notice that both of these say specifically that he reigned in Jerusalem. And then at the end of his reign, that they buried him there in the city in Jerusalem. And Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his stead. Now, at this time, it was not unheard of for a young man to have a child, so of course that is a possibility. But if we look through to verse 1 of chapter 29, and this is something that Elder Vanessa brought out in her comment, Hezekiah began to reign when? When he was 5 and 20 years old. So if Ahaz only reigned for 16 years and began to reign when he was 20, then he died when he was 36, right? So if he dies when he's 36 and his son is 25 and took over when his father died, then how old was his father when he was sired? 11, right? So that is really, really young, even for that day. Now, my suggestion is that that's probably not the case. You see, because what would have happened if Hezekiah was a young man, and even though it says right here, and Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his stead, what would most likely have happened if he was too young to take over is that someone would have been reigning for him. He would not have been a child king. There were very few examples of child kings who took over. Most of the time it would have been something closer to a dowager, right? Some powerful mother of the king type of setup. But let's see if there are any concordances or anything that gives us some insight into this. So the first one that is really important, just a second. I'm going to pull it up and put a link in there. To look at. Sorry, because this is a really good one, and I apologize for the wait. I'm trying to get it to be pulled up. Here we go. All right, so the Blue Letter Bible often will have, and that's a website, often will have some good resources. So I'm going to go ahead and post that link. I don't know if that came through as a link or not, but you should be able to pull that up. And of course, as always, no resource on the Bible is absolute. You can never look at something and be like, because this says X, Y, Z, therefore I believe, that. You always have to take this with prayer. You always have to do your own research. Okay. Let's see if we have a timeline in here. So this is how you pull something like this apart. A lot of people will have already put together timelines. And if you pull several of them up, then it will really give you a good picture of what was going on. Okay. Okay. All right. So I don't see a timeline in this resource. I'm going to see if I can find one in another. I will tell you that it is possible for a child of 11 to have a child. Now, especially if you're talking about someone who was morally bankrupt from the very beginning. I don't see why that doesn't jive with his character, but I'm not going to make the claim that that is an absolute. Okay, so I've seen a couple references so far to this, and all of those references seem to suggest that he was indeed 11 years old. Okay. All right, so there are a couple other interpretations of this as well. For instance, there's one that interprets this as Hezekiah being age 11 when his father dies, not the other way around, because what they're saying is that essentially that this was misinterpreted, and instead of saying that he was 25 years old, that he should be Abijah, which would be the daughter of Zechariah, in which case he would be 11 years old when he begins to reign under his mother. But that kind of, that doesn't jive with the way that these words are. In my opinion, if you look at this, like the sentence structure seems very clear that Hezekiah is the one who was 25 years old when he began to reign. Okay, so here's an interesting chronology. I will go ahead and post this, and you guys can take a look at that. All right, so in this chronology, Hezekiah becomes a co-regent while his father is still alive, but does not take over as king until he's 25 years old, which means that it still matches events. His father would have had him when his father was only 11. Or Ahaz is actually, in this timeline, it shows Ahaz as being 15 when Hezekiah is born, it looks like. But Ahaz does not begin sole reign until he's 24. So Ahaz then turns 24, and that would make Hezekiah 9 when Ahaz is 24. And then Hezekiah would be a few years later. Hezekiah is now 11, becomes co-regent, and continues down through to where Ahaz dies, which these numbers do seem to jive with the scripture. So that is a very possible scenario. Okay. Now let's look down to see when Hezekiah dies. Let's see how old it says that he is when he dies. All right, so in Chronicles, let's see. Okay. We're going up through 33. Yeah. All right, and it does not mention how old he is when he dies in Chronicles. So let's go back to Kings, and let's see what it says in Kings. Okay. We can go down to the end of this. So this is a lot less of a almost a preaching session than you may be used to, but that's okay. This is closer to a normal Bible study, what a Bible study looks like. All right, so I made a pool, conduit, brought water into the city. Books of the Chronicles. Okay, so neither one mentions when he, like at the end of the passage, how old he was when he died, but both of them say that he reigned for a certain number of years. Both of them say that he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, which doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we like to add things together and see that it's a straightforward chunk of time. But a lot of times what happens with these is because they used a different dating system than what we're familiar with, there's overlap. Like, for instance, the year when he starts to reign can be counted on both sides. How old he is can start, you know, when he's conceived rather than when he's born. There are just a lot of different things that create confusion here. So it's something where people can pick up a lot of, yes, exactly, the 29 years plus 25 years, how does that equal 54, right? Or rather, equals 54, yeah. So there are a lot of time limit issues that people run into when they try to apply today's way of looking at it. Plus, what happens that's super confusing, and this is something that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain in this session. I might go back into a next session and have more of a teaching setup prepared. But is that the way of keeping time changes at a certain point in Israel's history. So in the Bible, you'll see that it is keeping time one way, and then it starts to keep time another way. And so having that disconnect becomes key. And yes, exactly. In Jerusalem is the key. So I believe, if I remember correctly, what happened with a number of these kings is they started reigning as regents, which means that they'll say they began their reign in this year, or they began to reign for this many years, and they began their reign in Jerusalem, and they reigned in Jerusalem for this many years, because as a regent they weren't they weren't the be all end all, they weren't the top dog, so they were not said to be reigning in Jerusalem. But like I say, I'm going to have to revisit this one with some solid answers. So I apologize that I don't have an absolute answer for you. But really, this is kind of what you have to do in order to nail down answers, is look in a lot of places and see what resources there are. One of the things that can be really helpful when nailing down a chronology like this is looking at the surrounding kings, because they're all mentioned a lot of times. Like we saw in 2 Kings 18 that it says that it's the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel. And so if we look in the chronology of Israel, we'll see that that has its own timeline, and we can sort of follow that and see if we can't set up a measuring stick by which to judge these times and have a more accurate answer. But yeah, so the short answer is that this is really confusing. So it's really easy to stumble over, and a lot of times it may be wise to avoid these type of questions, but it can also be dangerous, because if you do, then you may find that eventually this will come back to bug you, and somebody might challenge your faith on this and say, well, if you knew that the Bible was full of errors, then how can you trust it when it tells you that Jesus saved your soul and you're going to heaven? And so it is important for us to do this kind of research and to have answers for these things. And I am sorry, I have done this research in the past, but I just can't remember it off the top of my head. So I am going to go back, and I'm going to see if I can't get a timeline that I believe to be accurate, and why, and show you guys through scripture next time. But does anyone have any other questions that we were going to tackle on the spot tonight? Okay, all right. So then in that case, I thank you all for joining us this evening. Let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll see if anybody can find something interesting on this week. It may be interesting to, for instance, look at this in an interlinear. It may be interesting to look at this with a number of different translations. And it may be interesting to see what different chronologies people have made and why, and what scriptures they use as their references. Because you can really sort of make a more well-informed decision and understand this better when you start to look at the research other people have already done. But let's do that real quickly. Lord, thank you so much for your presence, and thank you for Holy Spirit for helping us to interpret the scriptures, even when they are questions that we don't know the answers to, and we're looking to try and understand things that seem confusing. We just pray that you would help us to pick that apart and to look in the right place. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and like I say, next week we'll come together with the conclusion to this one and see if we can't pull something more solid together. So go with God.